For a few days now, and I could even say weeks since that whole thing started in Venezuela, the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro. And it continued with these apparently increasingly imminent attacks by the United States against Iran. Since the empire has awakened, fighting for the hegemony that it seemed to have completely lost, but now it is fighting for those remnants to regain the power it once had. And maybe even a little bit more of it. But since all of this started happening, let me tell you that I have been absolutely amazed reading some comments and very hurt. Partly also about whether it's the Russian Federation or China, about the betrayal by both, especially by Russia. First, this had to do with Venezuela, but now we are experiencing it again with the issue of Iran. So let me tell you a few things that I think are absolutely necessary. And I'm going to speak my mind in a completely calm way because I am who I am and my circumstances. On this channel, we don't intend to play at any kind of revolution. Here, you and I come to analyze geopolitics from the perspective of real politics. That is, starting from the premise that each state has its own interests. But allow me to tell you that I do not accept that the Russian Federation is labeled as a country that has absolutely betrayed anyone. Since the beginning of its existence, Russia has had several differences with the United States in particular. First of all, Russia has never been an empire in terms of wanting to go further, colonize, or invade other territories. That is, the Russian Empire existed, but it was very different from what is known as other empires and from what we understand today as imperialism. Russia does not have imperialist ambitions. And also, I believe, since the time of the Soviet Union itself, that's why this hurts me, especially coming from the Latino community. Between Russians and Latinos, I think we've understood each other quite well, because that same misery, in terms of being treated all the time as if we were second-class citizens, was happening to us. From the collective West, this has been experienced so much in Russia, which has remained as the heir of the Soviet Union. Just like in the vast majority of Latin American countries, they've tried to come here to Russia and there to Latin America, also to wipe their boots with our sweat and our blood, to take away our territory, our resources. In some cases, it worked out better for them, but in the case of the Russian Federation, now it's backfiring on them. I understand all this call within many countries in Latin America. Well, what they want and intend is for Russia to come and save everyone, and for Russia to somehow ensure the peaceful existence of the world. I understand everything, and with a heavy heart, I must say this isn't possible. Saying otherwise would be a lie. I'm not saying this because Russia wouldn't like to do that. I'm saying it because geopolitics is that harsh. And Russia has the desires on one hand and the resources on the other. It's doing everything it can. Russia is one of the best allies you could ever imagine. Russia has been there for Cuba. Russia has been there for Venezuela until the very end. It has provided all kinds of support, economic support, logistical support. And I'm not just talking about these moments. Now, it seems that since the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, the only thing that's being considered is how things went with the kidnapping itself. When Russia, I repeat and emphasize, provided support in the form of military specialists in every sector. This channel has many videos explaining why they went and what they did. Even the Wagner Group, who had a very specific role there, but it was a small military contingent, intended to help train personnel within Venezuela. The air defense wasn't activated, but who was responsible for it? The Russian Federation? That's unlikely. Now let's move on to the topic of Iran. Russia has been supporting Iran, fulfilling each and every one of its commitments to Iran. Recently, the treaty has finally been signed. This strategic one that Russia has been trying to achieve for years. From Iran, when Russia effectively proposed to deliver a kind of air defense systems. They ignored it and refused to acknowledge any issue. Each country has its own interests, and that's understandable from this channel's perspective. Of course, it's understandable that China acts according to its interests and that Russia acts according to its own. But the Russian Federation hasn't betrayed anyone at all, and at all times has stood up to the collective West with all the means at its disposal. The thing is, here we have to take into account whether we want to analyze reality and behave like adults. Go beyond the catchy slogan and the let's do this and let's do that, moving forward with the ultimate revolution. Instead, I repeat, we need to plant our feet on the ground and actually see what the world around us is like. We must understand that Latin America has historically not been the sphere of influence of the Russian Federation. In fact, the Soviet Union did try to have small countries there as its sphere of influence, but the United States has also been present there. So, why do we say that Russia doesn't want Ukraine to have the presence of NATO troops or NATO weaponry, let alone the possibility of having NATO nuclear weapons? Well, would the United States allow Russia to do that in Mexico? Russia, in fact, so as not to destabilize the region, because they know perfectly well that on a diplomatic level, they can have better and better relations with the vast majority of Latin American countries. But they also can't make certain military moves without ultimately harming, first and foremost, the country that hosts them, right? This case could be Mexico, it could be Venezuela, because the United States considers that its sphere of influence, and little by little, we have to stand up to the empire, of course. And that's what's happening. The Russian Federation, let me remind you, is the only country right now that is fighting against the entire collective West in Ukraine. Because it's not fighting against Ukrainian soldiers, it's fighting against the entire North Atlantic Alliance, and it's doing it for everyone else. Whatever comes out of Ukraine, the result that comes out of Ukraine will, of course, influence the distribution of power at the international level. It will influence what happens in Venezuela. It will influence what happens in Iran. It will ultimately influence things globally. And Russia is doing this practically on its own. Yes, China is supporting. Yes, China is buying oil and also selling drones to Ukraine. And from Russia, absolutely nothing is being said about it. Putin keeps calling him his great friend because he's an international statesman. He is a leader who understands perfectly that you can't ask another country, the Chinese, to be more Russian than the Russians. It's absolutely impossible. What the Russians have to do is defend the interests of Russia, which in this case are also the interests of international justice. Because in contrast to that, what we have is Donald Trump saying, I'm going to do whatever the hell I want, and saying it in an absolutely negative way. Here we are no longer governed by international law, says Donald Trump. So the United States follows its own morals, whatever the hell we want. I repeat, this is absolutely inconceivable from Russia's perspective. They try to build rules, they try to create all kinds of regulations, and international legality has been respected at all times, even when those on the other side haven't respected it at all. So I'm not just saying this from an emotional point of view, although it also hurts me deeply. To say Russia has completely betrayed anyone, especially here where I am now. In Donbass, Russian soldiers are dying by the dozens day after day, and it's been a very tough war. Families in the Russian Federation are losing loved ones, while Latin American comrades are fighting too. Of course, Alexis Castillo died as a Spaniard, as a Colombian, and as a Russian, and, well, also as a citizen of the former Donetsk People's Republic, since he already had the passport, but at the time, it was no longer official. It no longer existed because it had been incorporated into the Russian Federation, which recognized it, but he died as a Russian. He was a comrade. He came from Colombia, and indeed, he understood something fundamental for which I remember he fought. Let's go in bulk. He often argued with his communist comrades, especially the hardliners who called Russia imperialist, telling them they were stupid and didn't understand anything. Russia doesn't want to be anyone's empire at all. It has its spheres of influence, and what it wants is to maintain a stable order in the world, that there are clear rules, and above all, that people and the sovereignty of countries are respected. In other words, that nations themselves can choose their own destiny and that they must be respected. First of all, the collective West, because they are the first ones who do not show respect. But actually, respect should be shown globally. To respect and to be respected. That's the only thing the Russian Federation has stood for, especially in recent years and since Vladimir Putin's government began. So, allow me to tell you that, first of all, well, Russia, as some of you mentioned in the comments, can't be everywhere. It's not a God that sees everything, understands everything, and acts against everything. It does exactly what it can. And I think that many times it even goes beyond its capabilities and ends up paying for it. But really, next time someone tries to cross out the Russian Federation, who are my compatriots? First of all, as traitors of who knows what. Well, that person should remember where the Russians are right now, who the Russians are fighting against, how the Russians are fighting, and in what numbers they are doing it. Because it's not just a handful of people here. Here, a significant part of the country is directly on the front lines, risking their lives, not just for the security of the Russian Federation, but for a better world for everyone. In Iran and Venezuela, they're both doing what they can alongside that. But I also think that we need to take some of the international responsibility off the Russian Federation and, from time to time, put it on the shoulders of our own countries, always trying to effectively seek a global alliance. And first of all, the countries of Latin America should seek that global alliance among themselves. In the face of the empire that is increasingly trying to seize more of their resources and their territory, well, ultimately, it seems that the American dragon has awakened again. Let's see how far its energy goes. But the responsibility also lies with the countries of Latin America. And hopefully, this can be achieved. We must finally stand up to and reject the empire. But this requires mutual respect and collaboration with the Russian Federation, which I believe is essential. Instead of looking for traitors among us, we should learn to breathe calmly and remember that history is only just beginning. This is only the beginning of the construction of the multipolar world. And now, even when it seems that all is lost, it's only the beginning of the battle. Everything else will come, and we will see what the consequences will be and for what. That's as far as I can say. And thank you very much for listening to me up to this point because I truly needed to say it so urgently. I hope my position on this matter is clear.